Good evening and welcome to Bookmark. Today we are taking a look at a book written by an American novelist called Kim Stanley Robinson. The book is titled The Ministry for the Future. This, you will notice, is a rather unusual title because it is not a ministry of the future but a ministry for the future. The book has a dramatic opening. The opening chapter is set in an unnamed city in Uttar Pradesh, where there is a wet bulb event. A wet bulb event is when heat and humidity cross a particular threshold. And when that happens, people can just collapse and die. In this place in Uttar Pradesh, there is a wet bulb event, and overnight, 200,000 people die. Indeed, from that particular town, there is only one survivor. His name is Frank May. He's an American aid worker. But across North India, the heat wave kills 20 million people. The world will never be the same again because one episode of extreme weather has wiped off 20 million people, all from India. The book is about the world that deals with this horrible, traumatic event. Two things happen immediately. One, the Indian government is replaced. There is a general election. It's suggested that this is in 2024. And in the election, the BJP is voted out. Yes, a New York-based writer actually says that the BJP is not coming to power in the next general election. He also says that the Congress is nowhere in the race. It's also knocked off by the Indian public because the Indian public are fed up of the policies followed by the governments in India, which are basically the policies of crony capitalism and neoliberalism. And Indians say, this is what has led to the great Indian heat wave and the death of 20 million people. So what happens? They elect a new government, a government that has never existed in India before, with a lot of small grassroots organizations throwing up leaders and these leaders forming a new government. When the new government comes to power, they do certain things quickly. Number one, they shut down all coal mines in India. This will lead to problems. For example, we will not be able to generate as much power as we were generating. But they say that doesn't matter. What matters is not power. What matters is whether there will be another heat wave and another massacre like the earlier one. Another thing that they do is to send up aircraft. Indeed, a fleet of IL-78s that India has is used for this. They send up aircraft which will spray aerosols over the Arabian Ocean. Indian scientists have decided that the best way to stop the heat wave from recurring is to scatter aerosols over the Arabian Sea so that they will be borne by the wind over India and there will be a cloud, a brown cloud over India. This actually happens, and when this happens, the temperature comes down. Not by much, but what the Indians say is, we just want it to come down enough to prevent another great heat wave from occurring. Now, other countries are furious. China, for example, is very, very angry, but there is a prospect that the brown cloud will one day move to China. But the Indian government tells the world, none of you bothered about us when we were the victims of this extreme climate event. So we have decided that we have to save ourselves. India blames the developed world and China for what has happened. And India is determined, this is a new confident India, this India is determined to use science and evidence to pull India out of this situation. The world reacts in various ways, but generally it is business as usual. One thing that happens is that under the Paris Agreement, it is decided to start a new agency. The agency is based in Zurich in Switzerland, and it is named the Ministry for the Future. At the head is a diplomat named Mary Murphy. She is Irish, she is motivated, she is very clear thinking, she is extremely diplomatic and well organized. And she organizes a ministry which is made up of bureaucrats from various parts of the world. Her number 2 is a Nepali Indian, Badim Bahadur. And the team at the Ministry of the Future have one task. What is that? We are here to protect the rights of the unborn. The children who will be born tomorrow or the day after, or maybe 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, have rights. There is nobody who is bothered about their rights. It is the Ministry of the Future's remit to ensure that these rights are protected and there is justice for the unborn generations. So, 2 things take place. The Ministry of the Future decides that business as usual will not work. And if that should not happen, there have to be fundamental changes. For example, there has to be a fundamental changes in the way in which banks operate. There has to be a fundamental change in which how energy is generated and consumed. The most interesting thing about both the Ministry of the Future and the Indian government is that they're not dogmatic. They look at all potential solutions, pick the best of those, and the Ministry of the Future will nudge governments and corporations into doing what should be done. Now we know that corporations and governments are generally driven by profit and driven by electoral success and questions like this. But this is not what animates the Ministry for the Future. They are bent on ensuring that climate justice and equality and environmental concerns are at the top of the agenda of all people. There is a chaotic time. There are droughts and famines across the world. The children of Kali, a terror group which supposedly has its roots in India, has been formed, and the children of Kali are merciless. They target individuals, for example, leaders of petroleum companies, armament manufacturers, and assassinate them. In 24 hours, they bring down close to 100 commercial aircraft and send out a message to the world: stop or we will do this again. They take out a huge number of very big petrol or carbon driven cargo ships, container ships, and say, no, anyone who does this again will be targeted. Davos, the famous Davos meeting of the super rich, is taken over by a group of people who appear to be Naxalites from India. They don't harm them directly. They force them to continue their conference, but without food and water, and most important, without any access to the toilets. So all the rich people in Davos are forced to watch documentaries on poverty and climate justice, and then walk into the woods to pee and to shit, and to eat what little food they can get. So they get a taste of what the ordinary man in a third world country experiences. And while they're very unhappy, there is nothing that they can do about that particular thing. They return from Davos, of course, change people with some idea about what the world is going through. After 2 or 3 decades of this kind of chaos and action in various parts of the world, including geoengineering projects that are conducted with very clear and specific aims, the world begins to change. There is a project to pump melting water from under the Antarctic to the top and turn once again into ice and snow. And this goes on for a couple of decades, and at the end of which we find that the Antarctic is no longer melting. Towards the end of the book, a lot of good changes are beginning to be reported. The total amount of carbon in the atmosphere begins to come down. The world is a different place. In most countries in the world, capital systems have been totally dismantled, and in its place, cooperative systems have been put in place. Kerala plays a leading role in this. The decentralization that Kerala implemented some years back is picked up by the Ministry of the Future and by a lot of governments across the world and implemented in various places. I think that somebody should tell Dr. Thomas Isaac and S.M. Vijayanand that a project that they piloted, a project which I am told was conceived by our own I.S. Gulati, the economist, is being implemented across the world in this futuristic novel. So here is a novel that can be called a baggy monster. By the way, baggy monster is a definition of a novel given by a 20th century critic. It's about 600 pages. There are 106 chapters, and two things take place in these chapters. Various ideas from economics, from science, from ecology, from cognitive science, and practically any area of knowledge connected to, relevant to the earth and people is examined in these chapters. I'll give you some interesting examples. There is one chapter which is written by, in the first person, a photon as it travels from the sun to the earth. There is a chapter that is actually the voice of the free market. There is another chapter, this is most interesting, which actually is the voice of excrement. What is the role of excrement? If you're an ecologist, you will realize that human excrement and animal excrement have a huge role to play in recycling resources, and you have a chapter like that. At the same time, the story of some very interesting individuals like Frank May, the man who survives the great Indian heat wave, and Mary Murphy, and various other characters are taken forward. Some of them meet violent deaths, some of them are assassinated, but at the end of the book, what happens is something that will fill our hearts with joy. There are signs that a good Anthropocene is being born, that the world has finally tackled the two big existential crises we are facing. One, the sixth extinction, the mass extinction that is currently underway, and two, that is perhaps as important or more important, climate change. So we find that at the end of the book, we have the emergence of a fair, just, equitable earth where animals and plants, nature in short, are given as much respect as human beings are, as a result of which we can look forward to a utopia. We travel through a dystopian land, but eventually we reach what is probably the future of the earth. Kim Stanley Robinson is an American, and like most Americans, he is optimistic about what will happen. But the most wonderful thing for me in this book is a role that is played by India. It is no longer the role of a subaltern, it is a role of a master. Let us hope that it is actually the role of India in the future. The Ministry for the Future is published by Orbit Books from London and New York. In India, it is priced at 699 rupees. I hope you'll get it and read it. I can promise you it will be a gripping read. Thank you very much.